Right. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for persevering to this point. Great to see you all here. There are some more seats down here if people at the back of the room want to sit down. I'm going to talk about, in nowhere near as an exciting way as Jason has on the main stage, about data stewardship. Now, data stewardship is a really important component to what we want to do going forward. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll kind of understand why and exactly what we're trying to do. Now, you'll notice I have empty seats here. I was going to fill them up with teddy bears from the outside, but you're just going to talk to me, or I'm going to talk to you. And what I'd really like you to think about as we're going through this is some questions to come back, because I'd like to keep an open session on this to actually get some feedback from you about things you don't potentially quite understand. Because there is always in this, and every time we talk to people, we explain it, and then there's a secondary light bulb moment that's required. So it'd be great if you could interact with me on that. So that's why we haven't got a panel here. You're the panel on this particular one. So let's talk about data stewardship. Now, lots of words here. And these are the kind of standard definitions, which if you go and look this up, or go onto ChatGPT and ask it what data stewardship is, which I didn't do. I did write this myself. It will tell you that this is all about oversight of data and assigning the responsibility for what you do with that data to a particular party. Now, that could be data stewardship inside an organization. So a company could look at that as a role that it has there, a data steward. Or in the context we're talking about, this is a company or a group of users of data actually having a central body which takes that function. So I'll use this throughout the presentation because it's the way that people think about it. But note that data trusts here are used in inverted commas. So that when we talk about this, quite a lot you'll hear the term data trusts. But let's not confuse that, and you'll see in a moment, with that actually being a trust type of structure that we have here. Let's just talk about this and think about it in this context as a term. So data trusts. What you have is, as I mentioned, organizations of some type that are holding, collecting, able to process data in different ways, and predefining the way that happens. When you then get into the kind of trustee element, there are people who are responsible for saying, we said we're going to do that, and we are responsible to make sure that's the way we actually do it. So predefining your purpose, predefining your use, predefining all of those things around data that are important. So trustees take on responsibility for those decisions. They also take on some liabilities, obviously. They're sitting in a position where they're saying, we are going to use that data in this particular way and hold us accountable if we don't. We'll talk a little bit later about who the we is. So why don't we do this now? Well, actually, if you look at the world in general, and we'll talk about Facebook in this context, or Meta, however you want to term it. So Facebook, if you look at in a worldwide context, has been held to account for its use of data. Now, it's sort of obvious that Facebook and probably all social media use data that you put into them in some way for some other aim. So you'll go into Facebook, you'll go into Google, and you all know that ultimately you get directed to particular adverts for something that's related to something you're searching for. So there's an accumulation of information, and collectively this is called a thing called surveillance capitalism. It has a title where they're using your data for purposes to sell back to you. They're giving that information to other people. Now, the reason that Meta and Facebook got into trouble is for years and years and years, they'd been relying on the fact that they're giving you a free service, so you really aren't going to question it too much. And all the legalities are buried down in their terms and conditions, which no one ever reads. So in recent times, what's happened, particularly with them, is data regulators have said, that's not transparent enough. That's not sound enough to actually for the customers to know that's what's happening. And have issued some very significant fines, which they haven't paid yet, but they're sitting there in the hundreds of millions of dollars, because they're saying you are not telling the person enough, or giving the person enough information to make the decision about whether you participate in their monetizing of your data. Now, if you think about that, that's the start of a precedent for generally the world saying transparency of data and you knowing what your data is being used for needs to happen. Now, think of the consequences that are not happening. Now, Facebook being fined 380 million euros, I think they were in Ireland, is not actually probably very much money to Facebook. However, you deciding, because of rulings like that, to withdraw your data from them is a big deal for them. Similarly, if they take it forward, not Facebook in particular, but other new things that are using data in that way, if investors that they're trying to gain say to them, well, look, your model is based on access to data. How can you be sure that's going to be there for me to invest in you? There's a real interest in that consent and that transparency being there. So why aren't we doing this now? The reason we aren't doing this now is it hasn't become a problem until now. This is manifesting itself as a problem. And therefore, with every problem, as Jason said, there's an opportunity. And that's what has presented itself to us. So, I've talked about these: data surveillance capitalism, protection of the customer relationship, supporting investment. And actually, the other thing is, you turn the whole proposition around, there is a movement that says, well, actually, if it's your data and you're providing it there and somebody else is monetizing it, then perhaps you should get a share of that revenue. Perhaps they should be paying you to do this. So the monetization of your own use of your own data is, again, a thing that's being thought about. And you can't do that unless you put a structure around it. And actually, the other side to it is data regulation. There was, as little back as 2 years ago, when you talked about data sovereignty, where data sat in the world, everyone went, well, that's not a problem. It's all unifying. You can put it anywhere. It makes no difference at all. Actually, since then, data regulation has become fragmented. It's become very country related. So if you want to operate internationally, you have to conform to lots and lots and lots of standards, which again becomes problematic. It means there's an overhead that's associated with that, which you don't necessarily want. And I'll give you one example when we were talking about this, and it was a telecoms example. So a company that does essentially Internet of Things type activity. So it has all of these SIM cards around the world. But all the data it's collecting is something very simple from a device. However, there's a whole lot of data that comes along with that, which is unintentional. They know where the SIM is. They know all of those things. They don't need to use it. It's not part of their business model, but they've got that data. So all of a sudden, they have a liability that they hadn't considered. So if you then start thinking about, well, if there's something or somebody or some collective thing that can expertly look at all of those things, a concentration of knowledge, then that actually might be a really good thing and something that people want to outsource. They can't outsource the responsibility, but they could certainly outsource the ability to know how to do it properly and how to lower their liabilities. So what are the trends in this space? Called data trusts, in inverted commas, defining the transparency of the use of data. So actually putting in corporate documents, putting in statements that say, this is what we do and it is visible to you, not buried in hundreds of pages of terms and conditions, but right up front and center. Complications of data regulations. So if you look at GDPR, so GDPR is going to now be different in the UK to the EU. So all of a sudden, you've got two things to look at. You look at the Isle of Man's position on that. Which way are we going to go? We're going to sit in the middle. We're going to create something that's different. Don't know. But actually, these complexities you need people to look at, particularly if you're going to be global. Data sovereignty issues go along with that. Where does your data sit? Who owns it? Who controls it? Are all different questions. They're not the same one. Where the data is a very different question to where the data is owned. That's something to consider. And in looking at this, there's been some very significant work done by the Open Data Institute, the ODI in the UK, and also the Data Governance Institute, DGI, in the US. So if you wanted some bedtime reading, both of those have kind of 8-page summaries of this position, all of these arguments being made here, and a number of years of thinking about how this might be tackled. And some might say, because particularly ODI, they started this journey in 2019, where they started experimenting with this. They were coming up with the solution a bit before its time. This has now been refreshed in 2023, and that's been the kind of basis of what we've started to think about, using that experience that they got there, and more specifically, using the issues that they found doing things within a UK context, because certain things didn't exist there, certain types of corporate structures. Now, fortunately, some of those structures do exist here. So we have that capability to meet the challenges that the UK found in trying to do this. So what are we looking at? Now, data trusts, and I don't think there were going to be some people from Jersey here, so I'll talk about Jersey in their absence. Jersey did some experiments with data trusts, which kind of brought this whole area to our attention to some degree. But then when you looked at the ODI's assessment of the way that they did it using real trusts. But they have a different concept, as far as I understand it, in Jersey, where they have a purpose trust, which is slightly different to the trust structures that we have here. So when we looked at this in kind of legal terms, we went, there's some problems with trusts. One of those being the definition of assets. So data sometimes is an asset, sometimes it isn't. It kind of depends where you look in legislation. It certainly isn't well defined as property. And if you have a trust has to have assets. It has to have an asset to run it. So if all you're doing is running data, then in theory, you can't use a trust because it doesn't have an asset. So we've thought about that a little. And actually, we alighted on the foundations that we have in the Isle of Man. So we have a separate Foundations Act here. And that a foundation, just to kind of take it at a high level, is a hybrid between the trust and the company. So it has attributes of both. So that means it actually doesn't need to have assets. We'd like it to, but it doesn't need to operate. But it also means it can commercialize and license and have sub-companies and do all of those type of things that are much more difficult to do in a trust. So we have a structure here that is capable of doing this. We also have a Foundations Act that is specific to foundations. So if, and that is a big capital IF, we wanted to change this in legal terms going forward, then we can do that entirely within the Foundations Act without touching any other companies that exist here. We also have, last count, I had to count this manually, I think there were 178 foundations set up in the Isle of Man, so not a huge number, and the vast majority of them are charitable foundations. And when challenged as to why would we want to use foundations, foundations has a better legal structure globally. It's more recognized globally. Trusts are recognized in some jurisdictions and not others. Foundations are recognized everywhere. And also that persona that goes with it. When you talk about foundations, people think of those as being beneficial. By its name, it implies that. So the fact that actually that's what we want here, we're looking for ownership and transparency in a place that owns all of this data, then that kind of made sense. It fit into a pattern. Now, the next thing we looked at is, well, okay, let's use Facebook as an example, although we'd never be targeting Facebook. It's impractical for us to say, well, Facebook, we'd like you to use our foundation model here to give transparency to what you're doing, but bring all of your data and put it on the Isle of Man to make that happen. That will never take place. So you have to detach the ownership, the auditing of that to say it's doing the right thing away from the physicality. So you need to sit there and say, we are managing this, we're controlling, we will have tool sets and whatever is required to achieve that, but the data is going to live around the world. And that lends itself to a licensing model that is possible there, to the fact that data is being used elsewhere can sit under licensing. And here, what you get is trustees being responsible here for how that data is being used. That's why they need the auditing. The last two things, we talked about moving data towards having a value. There are two values, one to the end user, i.e. you pay the user because you're using their data. There's the other value to the company. Data we've mentioned at the moment is not clearly defined as an asset or property. So if as part of this process we can do that, then all of a sudden you've got a possibility for the value of your data to go on the bottom line, to become a value to that company. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily achievable, because that requires interaction with accounting principles, etc. But it's a possibility, and it's a possibility we shouldn't ignore. So that's roughly what we're doing and why we're doing it. I'll put this up here just for reference. So this is the DGI's overview of what a data governance framework would look like. Now, this is kind of focused on what a company would do internally inside it itself. But a lot of these principles about what are you looking at, who are the beneficiaries of these, and the processes that you go through are ultimately what we'd like to define as obligations for it to be a data foundation, things that should be the models that people are using to actually put that function in place. And I'd also say that if you operate this as a company, a foundation company, that has all sorts of links already into our regulatory environment. If you create a foundation, they have to be managed by an agent here, the same way as a 2006 company. So they're already locked into regulation. And here's a key point. Data trustees, or as in a foundation, they're actually called council members, but let's call them trustees for this purpose, are data trustees. They're not fiduciary trustees. So the opportunity we see for this, not only in terms of ethics, in terms of being within a biosphere and doing the right thing and being transparent, from a commercial point of view, this requires the type of skill sets we want to do all sorts of things here, including AI. But it's a solid foundation, if you pardon the pun, for people coming here because they can be data trustees. Those data scientists can come here because there is work for them to do. And for the TCSP industry and everyone else who's related with this, this is a unique selling point opportunity for them to manage these processes for people, manage that transparency. So this has two effects. One effect is it's a USP that we think we can grab, and particularly when we put it in combination with the biosphere, there is a fantastic opportunity if they choose to grab it for the CSP industry. And as part of that, we can attract the type of people we want to do other activities here, the data scientists. We've never really had a hook to do that before. This gives us that potential. Okay, so thankfully, you'll go. I'm going to stop talking there. And as I gave you a bit of a preemption to this, any questions from the audience? Aaron?
Hi, Kurt. I was just I was interested to see that OpenAI launched their program. I think it was last week for commercializing private data sets directly with them. Is there any alignment with that and this? Obviously, private data sets, I guess, wouldn't have a transparency aspect to them.
Yeah, that's going to be different, isn't it? So I think there's some angles for looking at the principles of things like that, and saying that not setting a standard as such, but saying this is what should be expected of activity, whether it's inside or outside. But I'd say that the point that we're at with this really is we had to figure out whether we could use foundations, for example, for this purpose. And it's taken us a little while to get there, and that's just happened, or just finalizing right now. So where we take it from here is going out and expanding its I wouldn't say its scope, but the interrelationships that we have to make sure that this has a global grounding. So whatever's happening out there, we have an interconnection in some way to it that gives it a context. So lots more work to do on that.
Sure. I was just wondering if the requirement for transparency was a property of a foundation in itself, or whether you could use a foundation to enclose private data.
I mean, you could. There's nothing stopping you doing that. I think the thing we'd have to work out is, I suppose, the cost basis for doing that. Whether internally you if you don't need to do it, would you spend the money doing it this way? I think perhaps part of the answer of that is what else you might want to do. So if you were looking at GDPR compliance, that might be something that you put into that pot and say, oh, it's worth it because of these combinations.
Thank you.
Oops. I didn't have the slide there. Okay, so I've answered some of these along the way, which is good. Does the data have to be on the island to manage it? The answer is no. We'd require some very fundamental, focused people to manage this. Absolutely. And that's what we need to acquire. But as with all of these things, it's a bit chicken and egg. If you haven't got a cluster of something to attract people here to, then it's much harder to bring them. This could create a cluster of need, which then gives the revenue behind it. How would this be regulated? Well, actually, it sits within the regulatory framework already. And because you're setting up essentially a company type, what we always have as a kind of caveat that doesn't need regulation is that there are circumstances in which you can refuse to actually set up a company here. So there are minor things that happen with things like names. If you have a particular name that the company's registry or somebody else in government objected to, they can say you can't set up the company with that name. I think possibly what we take that approach with this, where setting up a foundation would be something that's looked at a bit like a charity, to say, are the objects and do these things conform with the standards that we'd expect before we'd set them up as a company? And obviously, in other terms, you've always got that ability, if something's happening within that company, to strike it off, for it not to be there anymore. So it's not quite regulation, but using the legislation that you have. Couldn't you go anywhere and do this in a normal company? Yes, but who is going to say that you have done it properly? Who's the arbiter of that? Are you going to go to spend a huge amount of money with one of the big accountancy companies to say, yes, this works the way we expect? Or in this particular case, relying on a government to say, actually, this is conforming to these standards which we set it before it started. I'd say I'd be happier with a government doing that than a paid party to do it. Data is already an asset, isn't it? Actually, no, it's not. It is in some contexts and not in others. If it was a genuine asset, then every company would have a value of data sitting on their bottom line, and none of them do, because they can't. Accounting practice doesn't allow it. So data, the use of data might have a value, but that will be related to the revenue you get against it, but not the asset itself. So actually, and I'll give you a specific example of that. So we talk about asset and property are kind of interchangeable. So I was unfortunately part of a data breach here on the Isle of Man in the bank I work for, and 2.5 terabytes of data was exfiltrated from that bank. And you had to put in a report to the police here, so you had a number, a crime number for your insurance company. And actually, when they said, what's been stolen? Well, data. And they said, well, was it copyrighted data? Well, no, it was just data. And they said, well, that's actually not a crime because it isn't, no one's taken any property here. So the question was, so if they picked my server up and took it away, that would be a theft. Yes, but not the data on it, just the piece of tin. So there's a real case in point where data wasn't regarded in law here as property. Now, I'm not sure that exists everywhere, but certainly when you look at assets here, when you say within a trust or anything else, is this an asset? At the moment, it's debatable. Some would say yes, some would say no, depending on the context in which you used it. That's one of the things we want to clarify. People being dragged away. That's not good. Yeah.
Now, when you just said, thanks. So sorry, just to elaborate. So I kind of muttered to myself when you said, is data an asset? It's like, well, no, it can be a liability. You touched on companies that are capturing too much data and things that they don't need to process, which obviously falls foul of things in GDPR if they're then doing stuff with it they shouldn't be. Is there a potential within this framework then for someone to set up a foundation for liability data? We're capturing this that we shouldn't. We have more controls around it.
Yes.
And it's then almost in a financial world, it's off balance sheet.
Absolutely. So that was actually the illustrative example that I had there, because that's exactly what they wanted to do, is say, we now perceive there is a potential liability and we want that to go somewhere where it's managed. And therefore it can be used in entirely that way, which is the opposite way around to what you'd expect, but a real problem for some organizations. So yes, we could use it that way.
I've got a question about data protection, and you're defining data as an asset or property, and that would be potentially of an entity or a company. Where that contains personal data, they're not a property owner of that. It is the data subject themselves that owns that. They are merely a controller.
Okay, there's a specific answer to that, which is quite long, but I'll give you the short one. When you define property, you can define it with data, and this is part of the problem in a number of ways. One of the ways is not about owning it, it's about being able to process it. And the definition of processing, and therefore having property value of being able to use it, is fundamentally, if you can add, delete, or change it, you have a processing capability. Now, that's one definition of property, which doesn't impinge upon GDPR, because the property of what the data is still stays with the original person who put it in there. And then that ties back into, if you wanted to monetize, if you wanted to pay them, how that actually works. So this is why there's value to thinking all of these things through, because at the moment there isn't clarity. So what we want to do in here is get clarity, and GDPR is very important in terms of personal information. You're right. You
What kind of scope and opportunities taking around data stewardship has been considered actually within government outside of digital? So correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ODI data trust pilots was actually about food production and food labelling. So outside of it just being a new industry in itself, what opportunities is the government going to take from it as well?
Okay. So sitting in government or standing in government, I have to be careful how I phrase this. But consider a data trust can have it has a body, and essentially a detached body that manages what it says it's going to do, its purpose. Those are what the trustees are. It can then, into that trust, have multiple sets of data. So theoretically, and this hasn't been worked out, but theoretically, one of the problems we have with government here is siloed data. So in theory, it could go into a foundation and be managed that way, and data shared that way. Now, we haven't tested that hypothesis, but in theory, that's possible. And that would obviously be a huge advantage if it were possible. And that's one of the things that we are going to investigate from this point forward. That makes sense? Anybody else? Don't know how I'm standing for time at the moment.
Hey, Cope. Quick question. This sounds a little bit to me like an aircraft register or a plane register, right? So what we're essentially doing is creating something where we can register some data, but actually it's not going to create any tech jobs here in the same way that registering a ship here doesn't get you any crew jobs, and registering a plane here doesn't get you any mechanics, right? So if we look at that, it looks like a structure whereby we have maybe oversight and registration of data, but it isn't here. We're not handling it here. We're not doing anything here. We're not creating a data biosphere, whatever we were talking about earlier.
So it's absolutely not a registry. This is take the data away from this, and we have a very healthy industry managing trusts here. Trusts manage assets, ships, boats, whatever they are. But the trusts are set up in their own right by our CSP industry and elsewhere. This is exactly the same, except it's doing it for data. So we will be setting up companies here, or our CSP sector will be setting up companies here. So they'll get business out of that. It requires data trustees, which at the moment we don't have. We have fiduciary trustees here, but we don't have the data ones. So we have to employ those to do that. So there is payback right the way through the economy for doing this. The data doesn't have to be here, but the responsibility and liability does. So therefore that requires the same type of structures and the same type of activity as a trust that exists currently.
Sure. I think we're saying the same thing. So the jobs that it's going to create, or the value it's going to create, is within CSPs essentially, and people who perhaps do auditing of data. So maybe a Deloitte, for example, or a KPMG, as opposed to a digital type job as we...
Not necessarily. So if you think about trustees, so we're matching up with trustees here. So if you require data trustees, where do they come from? Those trustees won't be Deloitte and people like that. That's the auditors. The trustees, the people who take responsibility for that, at the moment are fiduciary trustees that exist in the CSP world. I would say that the CSP world doesn't have people who can do this type of trustee role, so they're going to have to acquire them. They can acquire them in two ways. They can hire them in, and that means they might not come here, or they can attract people who do that activity to be trustees on multiple things. And therefore, we've attracted high-value data scientists to the island, which otherwise we have no reason for them to be here. So the play certainly is to how do we get smart data people here? And this is one avenue with which we can do that.
I'd like to just add to that. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but when I spoke about it this morning, the fact we have 3 companies that we're looking to take through this model this year, certainly in that case, I think we would be looking at that data being on the island while we try to test this thing out. And I think there's still a little bit more thinking we need to do about can a foundation really manage everything if data is dispersed globally? How can they be truly accountable for that? Or is it something we do want to enforce through the Foundation Act to make sure that's here so that they can take full responsibility for it? But this is very much a trial at this point. We've got the components, we've got legal advice, we've got everything lined up now to start a trial. We'll start it safely. So we'll say this data needs to be on the island. At the end of next year, we're going to have a review and say, is that required? Is it not required? How's this work? But from an economic value perspective, it certainly would be our preference to keep the data here. And if that still creates a compelling USP, I think we'd probably end up going that way. I think theoretically, there's all sorts of things we could do with the Foundation Act. It's about just absolutely honing exactly how we're going to use this.
Okay. So I think we're at the end of our time there. So thank you very much for delivering me some questions and some challenges in there. That's great. Hopefully you found that interesting. We'll obviously be talking about this a lot more. This is the start of that process of socializing it. But we do believe that within this, as Lars said, you've got to figure out exactly how to implement this. There is a lot of potential opportunities that exist, and it's what we believe we can create as a unique selling point for the island if we do it correctly in the context of everything else we're talking about today, particularly around ethics and the biosphere and that whole AI part of what we're doing. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the day.